Hey, thank you. Thank you. Good to see you. I was hoping everyone would kiss me. I was the only taker.
Hello, everyone. My name's Archon Fung, and I'm the academic dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to discuss a topic that is not at all pleasant: patterns of political hate and violence in America today. On June 17th, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof opened fire with a .45 caliber Glock semi-automatic pistol at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church during a prayer service. He killed 9 people, including the pastor, all African American. Roof seems to have been motivated by white supremacist ideology and hoped to start a race war through the murders that he committed in Charleston, South Carolina. On June 12, 2016, Omar Mateen walked into the Pulse gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and let loose with a Sig Sauer automatic rifle, which is similar to an Armalite 15, and a Glock 9mm handgun. He killed 49 people and wounded 58 others. It was the deadliest shooting by a single individual until the Las Vegas mass murder in 2017. During the shooting, Mateen identified himself as a mujahideen and pledged allegiance to ISIL. Hate has always been a dark part of the American political experience, from a long history of lynchings to anti-Semitic persecution to the persecution of the Amish, mass shootings that target children or the LGBT community, and many other groups. Tonight, we explore an even more disturbing question than the history of hate. Is hate and hateful violence becoming more common or even more commonplace or normal in America today? And then, perhaps even more importantly than that, what can we do about it? We have 2 great guests here to help us understand the phenomenon of political hate and violence. Richard Cohen is the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The last time the SPLC was mentioned in this space was at the campaign manager's debrief with Robbie Mook and Kellyanne Conway in January 2017. I remember that night, Conway referred to the Southern Policy Law Center as an anti-Trump organization, and when Robbie Mook heard that, he was completely taken aback. That's one of the most storied civil rights organizations in America. What are we talking about? So there is some controversy about what the SPLC is and what it stands for, and we'll explore that a little bit tonight. When we were planning tonight's event, Richard asked if his security director could coordinate with our security director, and I thought, wow, you have a security director? The SPLC has been the target of bomb attacks and threats, and its leadership the target of assassination attempts. Such are the times that we live in. The SPLC was founded by Morris Dees and Joe Levin in 1971 in Montgomery, Alabama. It has pursued a wide variety of civil rights cases, including lawsuits on behalf of victims of organized white supremacist violence. The SPLC also produces widely used reports and statistics. It's one of the most well-known organizations in the United States tracking the frequency and incidents of hate crimes and hate organizations. And it provides and generates educational materials around political hate and violence, including documentary films. Under Richard's leadership, the SPLC has won a series of important cases against white supremacists and other hate groups, including a $38 million judgment against the Klan for burning a South Carolina church. Richard has also testified numerous times in Congress about white supremacy and served as the executive producer of SPLC's documentary films, 4 of which have been nominated for Academy Awards, and 1 took home an Oscar. Cornell William Brooks was the president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, until 2017. Cornell led the NAACP to the early edge of many social justice struggles, including pressing against racial discrimination of local government and law enforcement in Ferguson, and for the environmental justice fight in Flint, Michigan after the water contamination crisis there. He was arrested in January 2017 at a sit-in protest against Jeff Sessions' nomination to become Attorney General. Sessions won, and you lost that one in case you hadn't heard about that one.
For the time being.
Cornell was the first public leader to call for the removal of the Confederate flag after Dylan Roof's mass murder of the Charleston 9 in South Carolina. Tonight's event actually was inspired by a conversation with Cornell in which he was reflecting on how when he visited NAACP chapters around the country, he was noticing violence and the threat of violence becoming much more palpable and significant. The NAACP, I suppose, has always received a continuous stream of threats, but it is novel for people brandishing AK-47s and AR-15s around NAACP chapters all around the country. That's a qualitative change in the kind of expression of threat and intimidation that's going on. Organizationally, Cornell reinvigorated the NAACP legal department by doubling the number of pro bono firms and hours. And under his leadership, the NAACP secured 11 major voting rights victories in 12 months. Cornell earned his JD from Yale University and served as a clerk with Chief Judge Sam Ervin on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. He directed the FCC's Office of Communication and was executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington. He also served as president of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. He's a graduate of Jackson State University and received a Master of Divinity, which he credits as a very important part of his education, from Boston University School of Theology. My co-host tonight is Sarah Wald. Sarah's my close colleague here at the Kennedy School. She is Chief of Staff and Special Advisor to Dean Elmendorf. She also teaches and helps to administer the joint degree program between the Kennedy School and the law school for people getting degrees in both law and public policy. Like Cornell, she received a JD from Yale. She was the Assistant Secretary of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation and former Assistant AG in Massachusetts. Before coming to the Kennedy School, Sarah served as Dean of Students and lecturer at HLS and then as Assistant Provost for Policy and Planning in Massachusetts Hall. Please welcome Richard, Cornell, and Sarah. Sarah, why don't you start us off with the first question?
Okay, is this working? I'm going to ask each of you a question, and Archon and I may jump in with either follow-up questions or clarifications, and then we'll open it up to the audience for their question. So my first question is, as Archon mentioned, America has always had a legacy, a history of hate and violence. Our history is filled with violence against women, with religious-based incidents. Richard Hofstadter, as historian, has called lynchings and vigilantism distinctly American institutions. So is it worse now, or are the social media, the internet, is it just amplified now? And tell us what the trends are. Richard, why don't we start with you?
Well, look, I would never compare the period that we're in today to the period when 3,000 I'm sorry, louder?
Yeah, I think
louder.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a soft-spoken person. I was saying that I would never compare today to the period of time when 3,000 African Americans were lynched in this country. I don't think anything compares to that. The system of apartheid that existed in that period of time and that still persists in many forms is a stain, on our country's history that we have not purged. I would also say, though, that the level of hate and violence in recent years has increased significantly. We see it. We see it in many different ways, in many different forms. FBI statistics say that the level of hate crimes has increased by about 10% in the last 2 years. Our statistics show that the number of hate groups in our country has increased by about 20% in the last 3 years. These are all different barometers of the level of hate and violence. If I could make one point about the FBI statistics, they are wildly unreliable. I'll give you an example. In 2016, Massachusetts reported about 400 hate crimes. In the same year, Florida, which is 3 times as big as Massachusetts, reported about 100. So those numbers would suggest that Massachusetts has 12 times the number, is 12 times more likely to have a hate crime than Florida, which seems unlikely to me. And of course, the fact is that hate crimes in many places aren't reported at all. If you're in Fort Lauderdale and you want to draw tourists to your destination, you don't record them. In fact, about 88% of the jurisdictions in our country either don't report hate crimes or routinely report 0. So we don't really have a real accurate view of the number. Last year, the FBI said there were about 6,000 hate crimes in our country. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that the real number was closer to 250,000. So the FBI figures undercounted by a factor of 40. And so I think it's clear that hate crimes have risen in recent years, but I think the dimensions of it are hard to estimate, but I think the trends are clear.
Cornell?
Sure. So just to add on to Richard's point about the difficulty of measuring hate and the need to assert very clearly that we are experiencing certainly a resurgence of hate. The NAACP came into being in 1909 in the wake of a hate crime in the hometown, if you will, of President Lincoln, namely Springfield, Illinois. So we literally were birthed as a consequence of hate and came into being as a response to that. There's an iconic photograph that you'll see in the Museum of African American History and Culture, and certainly on the internet, that displays a flag hanging outside the NAACP headquarters in New York that says, "A man was lynched today." In the pre-Twitter world, that was our way of saying to the world that hate is manifesting itself. We see that now. So whether you look at the FBI measure, the Center for Hate and Extremism at California State, or the Anti-Defamation League, or the experience of members of the rank and file of the NAACP across the country, and certainly the ADL, hate is rising. Where we have Jewish journalists targeted in the midst of a campaign with echo symbols, having stars of David beside their names, where we have bomb threats at the NAACP headquarters, where I had to tell my staff to leave the building, go to a local church, and wait it out, and have bomb-sniffing dogs go floor by floor to determine whether or not there's a bomb in the place. Where we know, as a consequence of our advocacy, the more active we are, the more engaged we are, the more hate we will see in the mailroom in terms of letters or phone calls. The point being here is this is a serious moment. It is not a moment to be underestimated, and as Richard lifted up, this is not comparable to the era of lynching. But because we are aware of lynching, we have to take what's happening now very seriously.
I have a follow-up for probably mostly for Richard. If you had to draw a pie chart or inform the audience and us about what kinds of hate groups are most common and prevalent and which ones we ought to be worrying about most, who would be what would be your top 3 or 4? You know, there's the white supremacists, maybe there's Antifa, anti-Semitic groups, gay Muslim fundamentalist militant. Like, how do we think about the map of hate groups out there, and as a heat map, what really lights up for SPLC, what should light up for us?
Well, I mean, I think the most dangerous hate groups in our country are the neo-Nazi groups, especially some of the new alt-right groups. Groups like Vanguard America, which was the group that James Fields rallied with prior to running over Heather Heyer and injuring 19 other people in Charlottesville back in August. I think those are the most dangerous hate groups in terms of violence. I think other forms of hate groups are dangerous in other ways. For example, we would consider the Family Research Council a hate group. Some people might consider that controversial, but they consistently demonize the LGBT community, spread propaganda, demonizing propaganda about them, trying to link them to pedophilia, it's not just about gay marriage. Well, today, they may not be, killing people, but what they are doing is going to the White House and having an influence over public policy. So, that's a different form of danger. So we worry about both the hate mongers who wear, kind of white sheets and the hate mongers who wear business suits. They're both dangerous and dangerous in different ways.
So I would say one of the things that certainly is concerning to me is the unlocalized, if you will, amorphous hate that is perpetuated online. So when we think about Dylann Roof self-radicalizing, if you will, when he perpetuated that crime against Mother Emanuel, one of the leading churches in the denomination in which I was ordained, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, he self-radicalized, if you will, killed 9 students of Scripture in a Bible study. And the question that I asked in the wake of that racial massacre was, how did he get to this place? What shaped his philosophy? And so the question we have to ask ourselves is not just how well are they organized, but how well spread and widespread is their message? And what can we do to respond to that? That's what certainly concerned me at the NAACP, because when you lead a march or a demonstration, you have to worry about the folks who are organized, but you also have to worry about the lone wolves.
So why don't we go on to the obvious next question, which is if there is a rise in hate, or it's a different kind of hate or a different form. I know you've talked about some of the different methods in addition to online. Why? Why is it happening now?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. First, I think the main driver of hate that we see is a backlash to the changing demographics of our country. It's the same thing that's leading to a backlash, a hateful backlash in Western European countries, the changing demographics of those countries as well. Now, I think Mr. Trump has exploited that. I think he's exacerbated it in extraordinarily serious ways. But I think it's been underlying kind of what's been going on for probably 15 years. The number of hate groups in our country essentially doubled between 1999 and about 2010. And again, that was driven not primarily by President Obama's election, but by kind of our changing demographics. I'm sure that the financial crisis played a part, but much smaller part than I think our changing demographics. Again, let me say, I do think that Trump, I don't want to beat on him too much. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates, but we do call out hate in the mainstream when we see it. After the election, we counted approximately 900 hate incidents in only 10 days. And many of them, probably 40% of them, bore Mr. Trump's signature in one way or another. And what I mean by that is people using his name during the course of assaults, or writing on a building, "Making America White Again." And I don't think he's really taken responsibility for what he's unleashed. Mark Sanford, who's a Republican from South Carolina, said that President Trump has unleashed some demons. President Bush, the second President Bush, in a recent address, said that Mr. Trump had emboldened bigotry. And I think that's very true. But again, I think he was playing on a stage that was set for a number of years, both here and in Western Europe.
So we see a fundamental shift in the demographics of our citizenry, namely America is becoming more black and brown, more diverse in terms of our religiosity or lack of religiosity. And so we have a demographic backlash, but we also have a post-Obama blacklash. This cannot be ignored. It cannot be ducked. It is, in fact, real. And if we need not be historically alarmist, but we can have a historically informed conversation. So when we consider the 1920s, where the Klan rose from a post-Reconstruction handful to over 2 million members in a relatively brief span of time, driven by a toxic brew of anti-immigrant sentiment or xenophobic sentiment, a kind of faux patriotism and what I call a 2 Corinthian Christianity. Both meaning Christianity which is superficial, which is antithetical to the gospel, and that is in fact exclusive. In this post-millennium moment, we see some of the same forces at work. We see a faux patriotism. We see rampant and rancid xenophobia and misogyny. And this is fueled by a president who intentionally or unwittingly, I would argue intentionally, is fanning the flames. We cannot ignore this. It cannot be ducked. And I can simply tell you that as a young litigator, what I was taught at the Justice Department is if you want to have a sense of what the civil rights atmosphere in a community, talk to the local branch president of the NAACP. We have 2,000 units, 1,000 of which in the South, many of which are in small towns. These are the people who are on the front lines of civil rights. And they will tell you there is an increase in animus. A lot of this, not all of it, is driven by the rhetoric in the White House. And emblematic of that was the both sides commentary in the wake of Charlottesville.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that about Charlottesville. I think that President Trump was right when he said there were bad people on both sides. You know, we don't need kind of the Antifa folk showing up and deciding who gets to speak or who gets to march. Where I think he was wrong, way, way wrong, was the idea that there were fine people on both sides. Because I don't think that there were many fine people on the Unite the Right side who were rallying there. One other thing I would add about Mr. Trump, and you asked whether it was witting or unwitting, you know, this election was unusual in the sense that, you know, white supremacists openly endorsed Trump. Typically, the white supremacists, you know, they're like both parties are irredeemably corrupt, a pox on both their homes. And, you know, the idea, not a dime's worth of difference. This time, people like David Duke would say it would be treason to your race not to vote for Trump. You know, some of us, you know, again, some of us might have been, you know, upset at the election results. The white supremacists were celebrating. I mean, and that's the reality. I do think that Mr. Trump knew what he was doing. At one point, does anyone know who Alex Jones is? Sure. You know, he's like the leading conspiracy monger person in the country. You know, he runs this thing called InfoWars. Trump goes on his program and says, I hear you have a really fine reputation. And to me, it says it all.
So I want to press you a little bit on the
Go ahead,
Unite the Right point.
Right.
And so this is a question about normalization. I think it's easy for at least me to think, maybe a lot of folks in the room to think, okay, well, if somebody's wearing a white hood and is a wizard, that person is not a fine person. And it's easy to think about there's an extremist America and then there's the rest of us, and we got to minimize the extremist America, and for all of these reasons that we've been talking about. There's also talk now that it's not really the extremists anymore, that hate is being normalized, and that's what we need to worry about. But if hate is being normalized and normal people are participating in the Unite the Right marches and other marches and browsing the websites and going to the dark web or the not so dark web where a bunch of these hateful things are occurring, then some of those people are at least potentially fine people, normal people. So how do we think about whether or not hate is being normalized or whether we should still regard it as an extremist section of America that we ought to ostracize?
That was a complicated question, I've got to say. You know, one thing I would say about Secretary Clinton during her campaign, I mean, you know, when she used talking about Mr. Trump's supporters as a basket of deplorables, that was stupid politically, and it was unfair, because there are many people who I think, you know, were angry about their lot in life and angry about cultural changes, felt as if they were strangers in their own land, and I wouldn't, you know, call them haters at all. But I do think that the normalization of hate is real, because what we're seeing is social norms that used to provide a measure of civility being frayed, and, you know, kind of people acting on their worst instincts, we did a survey during the election in schools and asked teachers what was happening as a result of the rhetoric of the campaign. We never mentioned Mr. Trump's name. And of course, we didn't have to. You know, thousands of teachers wrote in and talked about the level of fear and anxiety that was in their classrooms. One letter that I'll never forget, a teacher wrote us and said, look, when some person would say something off color in my classroom before, I could get them to stop with just one look or one word. Now, suddenly, it's, you know, well, if the future president can say it, why can't I say it? And so that, to me, is the normalization of hate. I would not call that person a hater. Do you know? I would just say that the social norms that have defined good behavior seem to be in peril in our country.
I may beg to differ. This is a bad case of the politics, not of respectability, but the politics of disrespectability. Right. When you appoint Steve Bannon in such a high office in the White House, whose business model is propagating hate, you have in effect created a de facto office of legitimacy for the alt-right, i.e. white supremacy. That says a lot. Where we have in the Unite the Right, with the Unite the Right rally, white supremacists dressed up in golf shirts and chinos. Again, the politics of disrespectability. In the civil rights movement, folks dressed up in their Sunday best to bring out the best in the country. Here we have folks dressing in their best to bring out the worst in the country. These people are, in fact, haters. I don't have to tell you, you've litigated, you've locked folks up, you've taken away their property. So I would respectfully disagree, just from the vantage point that just because you dress well, speak well, it's not a matter of impropriety. They have an agenda. And there are people across this country who are reasonably and rationally afraid. And they're afraid because of these haters and the violence that they're capable of engaging in. But you know this.
I do.
Yeah.
Let me follow up with one question, Richard, though, that you talked a little bit about, and implicit in some of this is the notion that we've lost the ability to have civil discourse about agreements and that the polarization. There is some criticism that the SPLC hate list takes a very, very broad definition of hate, and by labeling such a wide range of groups or actions hate groups, it shuts down, it's further polarizing. I'm sure you've heard that before. And
I have. You know,
yeah.
the one thing we don't require for a listing on our hate group list is violence. You know, we don't say a group has to be a violent group to be a hate group. It can be spewing hateful propaganda and not engaging in violence, and we would call it a hate group. And we would define any group as a hate group when it vilifies entire classes of people on the basis of immutable characteristics or the like, such as race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or something like that, or, you know, animus towards the LGBT community. So again, I think, you know, some of that's controversial because some groups that we would consider hateful, quite frankly, have quite a toehold in the mainstream. But I think it's more important to call out those groups because I think that in many ways, because of their foothold in the mainstream, they're more dangerous.
Cornell, I don't know if you...
You're not going to disagree with me again, are you?
Yeah.
No, the list is expansive, but the list of those who are propagating hate in ways that are sanitized is pretty large, right? And so there's a difference. I mean, so with respect to the Family Research Council, there's a difference between a theological disagreement in terms of sexual ethics, right? That's whether a church or religious groups favors or disfavors celibacy or sex outside of marriage or between two people of the same gender. is one thing. It's another thing to vilify. It is
Yes.
another thing to create a caricature which lends people and makes them subject to being victimized.
Yes.
And I think that we are at a point in our nation's history where we need to be very careful about not calling out this kind of vilification as a predicate to victimization.
So I had one more question about the why, because obviously why is important to figuring out what to do about this. How gendered a problem is this? I mean, is it a problem of young white men? And is that who we need to be targeting to change?
Well, I think the overwhelming number of persons in the hate groups that we have encountered, have been men, have been young white men. There are some women in the movement, no doubt, but equality among men and women is not a hallmark of the white supremacist movement.
I don't know if you want to.
One thing I'm mindful of is certainly going back to the 20s, in the wake of World War I, we see this rise in the Klan. It's male-driven, right? There's a challenge in this country with a group of men who feel disaffected, they feel disconnected, there are a variety of economic class challenges, but we can't allow that to be a rationale and explanation for being a white supremacist. There are a great many, by that score, there are a great many men of color who probably are facing at least as many economic challenges, but that is not necessarily causing them to take up the cause of white supremacy or black supremacy or any ethnic supremacy. But it is a male issue.
So we had a really quite interesting exchange in preparation for this. Both Cornell and Richard are lawyers involved in litigation, and that requires them to engage with people on the other side of the table who oftentimes hate them and what they stand for quite deeply. And both Cornell and Richard emphasized the importance of treating someone on the other side with decency as a human being, even if they don't regard you or your client even as human. And so this is a more broad question about how do you help us understand how to engage with hate groups and people who are haters and maybe even to a violent extent in terms of whether we should engage and whether engagement means normalizing in some way or whether we should try to shun and ostracize and shy from normalizing those people. This comes up often in every campus discussion, as you know, with some controversial speakers, some of them extremists, and a lot of students, a lot of faculty have really voiced opposition to inviting extremist speakers because it's the normalization of hate. I'm on the side of engagement for sure, just to be transparent about that, but I can certainly understand the other side.
Let me go first.
I mean, I favor hearing from diverse voices, irrational voices, hateful voices, even voices that are dangerous. I favor that. But I don't favor moral timidity, meaning if you have the occasion to speak, you have the occasion to be held accountable, to be shamed, to be called out, to be boycotted, to be subjected to tremendous pressure. So we have sometimes those who want the microphone, but they don't want the responsibility of standing on the platform and being subject to criticism. That is simply cowardice, politically and morally speaking. But in terms of engaging people, I think, and here, I confess that, being a fourth-generation minister, I believe it is important to hold out the prospect and the possibility of redemption and love and and having some moral humility, meaning the worst person has within them the moral possibilities you possess within yourself. And so none of us should ever take the position, I can never be where that person is. It's morally arrogant.
I've met a couple exceptions to that in my life. but in general, of course, I would agree. Many of the people who have helped us in some of our most important cases were former hate group members who saw the light of day, who we talked to and try to convince to help us to maybe testify against the people who put them up, for example, to the church burning case that we had. The kids who burned the church, they went to jail, but the leaders who put them up to it, encouraged them, didn't. So, we talked to them in their prison cells and, convinced them to say what had happened to them. And maybe the most famous case we ever had, a Klan lynching case in Mobile. At one point during the trial, Morris and I were talking, and this one person who was on trial to us, in some sense, he was such a sad character. He was looking for any group to belong to. Had the bowling team called him first, he would have been a good bowler rather than a good cross burner. And so, we let him go in the middle of the trial and told the jury that his level of culpability was just not the same as kind of other folk. I agree with Cornell that, kind of no one is beyond hope. No one is beyond redemption, with a couple of exceptions.
So last question before we open it up to the audience. What should we do, both we as in we the people, and then we as individuals in this audience do, we the people at the policy level, and then we as individuals in this audience in our various lives, to combat or bridge or reduce the increase in hatred and hateful violence that is occurring in America and threatening us all now?
This is a point that certainly Richard touched on, and this being the Kennedy School, this won't be lost on the quants in the audience. We have to have the data, right? We have this problem that literally imperils democracy, that puts people's lives at risk, and we don't measure it, right? We need to have some leverage over law and local law enforcement to have them report these crimes, and they are in fact crimes. That's number one. Number two, I think rather than respond to each hate crime crisis as though it is sui generis, and we have to kind of start over, we need to take these crises as moments for organization, moments for catalyzation, moments to build our resources. In the same way that the NAACP came into being in response to a hate crime, we built an infrastructure, we built a field team, we built a department of publicity and research led by a young graduate of Harvard by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. We used that as an occasion to organize ourselves to fight against hate in the long term. In the wake of Charlottesville, in the wake of the Pulse nightclub, and God, certainly in the wake of the Emanuel 9, we can't keep treating this as though we have a bad and serial case of moral amnesia. We just keep starting over. We gotta measure the problem, get law enforcement engaged, reach out and build on these college campuses, and certainly go into those parts of the country that need this message. Right? We can't keep the message, if you will, within the Kennedy School. Right? We got to go to some places where the folks have a different accent, they dress differently, but they are as concerned about these problems as we are. But fundamentally, I believe it's a matter of certainly litigation, but it's really in the matter of investing in the grassroots apparatus to deal with these problems where they are in those communities.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with those sentiments more. I think each of us in our own lives have, a circle of influence. Our families, our friends, our business associates, and I think it's important to, kind of speak out in those moments and talk about events around you, and and engage people whose views might be different than yours. And ask them why. Why do you think that? And try to engage in intelligent dialogue. I think it's also important for everyone to exercise their superpower. Does everyone know what their superpower is? There you go. It's the right to vote. It's the right to vote. You know, our democracy is not healthy. I think Secretary Clinton, I think, won about 64 million votes. Mr. Trump won about 61 million votes, and about 90 million people who were eligible to vote didn't show up. They sat on their hands. And that's a sad fact about our country. So apathy, I think, is one of the most pernicious forces out there. And thinking that someone else is going to pick up the slack for you always turns out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. No one should doubt their own agency. No one should doubt their ability to make a difference, large and small. It's all of our responsibilities to push back against hate. It's all of our responsibilities to make our democracy work like it's supposed to.
Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience now. There are 4 microphones, 2 here, 2 there. Please line up at the microphone. And let us remind ourselves of what a question in the forum involves. It involves identifying yourself. It involves one question, not follow-up, and it ends in a question mark. So why don't we start here with this microphone, sir?
Yes, my name is it. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. My name is Stan Griffith, and I'm chair emeritus of an organization, Greater Boston Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, and I'm going to follow that rule. I promise. I tend to ramble, so I'll try to keep it brief, but I'm going to do my best Paul Revere impersonation here, because the right wing is coming to Massachusetts. We have on the ballot in November 2018, everyone know this, a proposal to legalize discrimination against transgender persons. It's certified, it's on the ballot. It is because of complacency, because the way it works in Massachusetts, it's going to be very confusing because it's a referendum to repeal, and we want people to vote yes. PFLAG is on the executive committee of an organization called Freedom Massachusetts. And so it's a yes vote means don't repeal the law. Okay. But there are enough conservative organizations. The state is already awash in money from out of the state right-wing hate groups, including mass resistance, which makes your list. And so I'd be happy to talk to anyone who's interested, but I would be eager to recruit others to the cause, including the center and the the Kennedy School, to making sure people are aware that in November there is a yes vote that's critically important, because they tried in Arkansas, they tried in other states.
Right.
They're taking it to the people.
Is there a question? Or
yes, I said, would this, I don't know if the center is aware of this.
We aren't, but we are.
I haven't seen it in any of the
but we are aware of the war on the LGBT community.
Oh, yes,
that's being waged by the Justice Department, for example.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about, the Trump administration trying to kick transgender people out of the military.
Yes.
We're talking about Senator Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, saying that Title VII, the Employment Discrimination Act, no longer protects the LGBT community.
Yes.
We're talking about the Justice Department saying that Title IX no longer protects the LGBT community. So, kind of that's going on. And just to add one last thing to it, these are serious problems. By our calculation, the LGBT community is the most likely to be victimized by hate crimes in our country. Probably twice as likely to be victimized as Jewish people or black people. So I think anything that tends to legitimize any form of discrimination is dangerous and wrong. So hopefully we'll be able to help in some way.
Be happy to try to be in touch about this further.
Cornell.
Sure. I certainly think one thing that can be helpful is we have a tendency to balkanize our own injustices. So what happens to trans folk happens to trans folk, what happens to Jews happens to Jews, what happens to blacks. And so one of the things that I think is critically important in any electoral campaign is having a broad diversity with everyone speaking to the issue in their own voice. So in other words, the NAACP being out front on this, right? So for example, with the Pulse nightclub shooting, I made it a point for the NAACP to speak loudly and first, or close to being first, in our voice. I think on an issue like this, the more breadth you have, the stronger you are.
Right. Okay, up here in the balcony. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for the incredible work that you guys do. My name's Alistair. I'm an emergency room physician down the street at Mass General Hospital. You know, with all the negative headlines, with the, as you guys call it, the normalization of hate, it can be hard to spot signs of progress. I wanted to ask both of you guys, what makes you guys optimistic about the future?
That's a great question.
I mean, it's the young people in our country. I wish they voted. I wish they voted and make their voices heard. But when you look at polls, I mean, it's a much more accepting generation than the generation that I'm a part of. And so, you know, kind of the young people of the country give me hope.
Mm-hmm. Variation on that theme, we sometimes can be very empirical with respect to what we're up against, less so with respect to what we have to face what we're up against. So when we think about at least 4 million women who are part of the Women's March, we think about a generationally unprecedented level of activism around the country among Gen Xers and millennials. When we think about what's happening with respect to the students in Parkland who are leading the fight, here's one little metric. When Ms. Gonzalez has more followers on Twitter than the NRA in 2 weeks. That's a number. And while we did not perform as well as we might have in the last election, but bearing in mind that young people led the country with African American women with respect to the election and re-election of President Obama. And so the point is not that we don't have the strength, we just have to marshal the strength and organize it. So there's a great deal to be encouraged by, and even in Charlottesville, notwithstanding the feckless response of the White House, young people were clear, very clear. That gives me hope.
Okay, why don't we go down here?
I don't know whether I can make this a question or not.
Please try.
Well, when you mentioned Charleston probably affected me more than anything, and because I served there in the Navy for a couple of years, 100 years ago. And back to the point you were making about people that were way violent versus people that were on the fringe wearing the right kind of clothes and not looking like they're part of the problem. I always thought back to the old CIA way of handling these things in South America. You didn't go kill the communists. You went and killed the left-wing liberals who were, just to the right of them on the political spectrum. So I don't mention, I don't suggest killing anybody. I just think that when you're really animated about going after somebody, you should go after them first. Because the whole right-wing violence thing has to be taken care of by law enforcement and courts. But the words that flow has to be directed at them. Basically, there's one organization that was in Root's case. I don't remember the name of it, unfortunately. It was called the Citizens Council or something.
Right.
And they were dressed up nice, and they got
the Council of Conservative Citizens.
Right. And that sounds nice, doesn't it? Well, I don't know what the question could be. Maybe just I would hope that people would, when they directed their own animus in conversations, head to head, that they would think about that when some guy on the right wing says, well, what about this? Well, he's not Alex Jones. Yeah, I know, great. That doesn't mean he's not a cancer.
Yeah, just very briefly, the Council of Conservative Citizens was the first website that Dylan Roof came to,
right.
And it was just filled with propaganda about black on white crime that was completely false.
Right.
It was the same propaganda, frankly, that President Trump tweeted during his election from the gutters of the neo-Nazi world. The other thing I would say about Charleston is in response to the question that was asked earlier, one of the things that gives me hope is what happened in that city after the killing and the way it came together. I saw it, it was remarkable, and I know Cornell saw it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, right here.
My name's Noah Sleeper, and so recently back home in Maine, there was a city manager in Jackman who was found to be an ardent white supremacist sort of after the fact that he'd been hired, and some of this I think was on social media, and some of it was sort of discovered later to be on in forums and that sort of thing. So I guess my question is, sort of when employers, especially local, state, sort of more municipal employers, are doing background checks on the people they're hiring, how deep do you think they should go? I mean, should there be someone scrolling through these forums looking for this person? I mean, how do you sort of catch people before they get to this position?
So, I mean, this happens already, right? So when people are hired for firms, for companies, a social media review is not uncommon. I think the issue here is making bias and bigotry a part of the screen, right? So we do it with respect to if you have a criminal background, people will, notwithstanding a ban-the-box law, do a Google search to find out whether or not someone has a criminal record, as opposed to having a bigotry record. You know, if you can exclude whole categories of people based upon immutable characteristics, I don't think you can serve well on a team.
I guess the only thing I just as a lawyer I would add is that I think it's perilous ground to start making employment decisions by the government on the basis of people's political philosophy. I think there are places where we advocate that that be done. For example, in law enforcement, we expose people who are members of hate groups because we think it's quite inconsistent with your responsibility as a law enforcement officer to be a member of a hate group. And the courts have basically upheld that position, thinking of law enforcement as almost a paramilitary thing. But I think it would be difficult to, public employees have rights, and sometimes it's the right to be a member of a group that you and I would disagree with.
Okay, up here.
Jay Gleason. Hate is actually a normal human emotion. Everybody has it. We don't really then know whether it's underreported, overreported, or should be reported at all because there is no universally agreed upon definition of hate. Last year, for instance, there was a series of threats called into synagogues around the country, and many people jumped to conclusions about it, and it turned out that the real culprit was a Jewish teenager in Israel that was doing that. So we have to be very careful about over-exaggerating and creating this climate of fear about hate in such an expansive way that it can either serve fundraising purposes for organizations like yours, Morris Dees has a long record of that, or for suppressing free speech by various political factions that we obviously are focusing on for other reasons than quote-unquote hate, which is a very amorphous term to begin with.
Is there a question?
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, the question is, shouldn't we be a little bit more careful about over-exaggerating and fanning the flames of fear about hate, because that in itself creates a reaction that can lead to these other types of either suppressing free expression or for promoting the fiduciary interests of organizations that feed off it.
Well,
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Thank you, please. Yeah.
So this whole idea of phoning in threats to synagogues, whether it was perpetuated by some kid in Israel is kind of like not the point. It's the point with respect to proving whether or not a crime happened as opposed to whether or not a threat was posed. So where you have children who have to leave their school because there's a bomb threat, there's a harm. Now, with respect to raising money off of hate or speculation with respect to hate, this has been some of the criticism that's been leveled, maybe not, certainly with the Southern Poverty Law Center, but also the NAACP. And I can tell you this, having people threaten to shoot you and having your members been shot. We've never raised a dime, not a dime, in terms of using hate as some tool for fundraising. Now, it's simply not worth it. So I don't think that that's the problem. The real problem here, or what you see, I should say, what you see around this country. Synagogues being defaced, churches being defaced, people being killed in a Bible study. That's a real problem, not fundraising on the basis of hate that doesn't exist.
And false reports.
Thank you.
And false reports that libel people.
We're not going to do follow-up. Here, this
my name's
microphone.
Jeff.
Thank you.
Is this on?
Yeah.
My name's Jeff Ackley. I'm the executive director of the Eco-Enlightened Charitable Organization. And what our focus is on getting people to think differently about climate change, and so that more people will want to take action and do something about it. And the way we do it is we get them to think about the eco-enlightened age, the future. And when people do that, it's sort of a positive outlook. And the reason why I bring this up is that there's sort of a trick to this. If I'm talking to somebody who's, say, a conservative, maybe a Trump supporter, or doesn't believe in climate change, if you talk about the future, losing things from climate change, like your ability to fish in a stream or a place that you used to go back to and swim and now it's polluted or there's an issue with it, you just see them open up and be willing to talk. So my question is sort of twofold. One is, I'm on Facebook and I'm in a discussion and I'm in a battle with somebody and I can see it's sort of a battle, if you will, but a discussion and it gets sort of hateful. So my question is, do you have some tips on how to, similar to this idea when it comes to climate change, if you talked about things you're losing, they open up, what are some things that we can do to facilitate a conversation to get people to open up? And the second question is, what can we all do tomorrow? What can we all go out and do tomorrow to make it sort of a kinder world that we live in?
Just preach to him.
No.
Preach to him.
So one of the things that I think is important is for us to look at, in some ways, the tragic opportunities that are presented to us, right? So in other words, when we encounter hate, seeing it as an opportunity for engagement, right? So in other words, you see these conversations online around these issues. People tweet, they're expressing outrage, moral condemnation. I think it's important to use those occasions to bring people together, to give people something constructive to do. One of the things that people talk about, certainly among social justice and civil rights leaders, in the wake of tragedies of hate, what do we give the people to do? Now, we're not talking about what we get done, but we need to give people an occasion to demonstrate leadership, to come together, to process. So, for example, in the wake of what happened with the Emanuel 9 in Charleston, being thoughtful about giving people an opportunity to express moral outrage, but also to express love. That's a part of leadership. And it's also a part of effective organization. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think it's incredibly important for us to appreciate in a digital world that social media does not merely mean media that's social. It means social media being a predicate to coming together, to organizing in a post-digital world or a non-digital world. I think that's just incredibly important and something that we need to do, particularly given that hate is rising in the country. So finding ways to bring people together, to organize together, and looking for affirmative opportunities for community. So that's not preaching, but I think you get my point.
One point, just a small thing. You talked about, getting people to think about what they're losing and looking ahead. It reminded me of a young man who we met who wanted to get out of the world of hate. He was having a hard time doing it because his face was covered with neo-Nazi tattoos. And the reason he wanted to do it, of course, was because suddenly he had children. He had been married. And suddenly he was thinking to himself, has this life that I've been living, is it going to be good for the future of my kids? Just like the person who might be thinking about the pollution of a stream saying, gosh, what kind of world am I going to live into? We ended up helping the person to get the tattoos off his face and to live a better life afterwards.
Well, we have time for only one more question, and I'm wondering, though, if there's a student. We haven't had a question from a student, so could we hear from a student, give an opportunity up here to a student? Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Savannah. I'm a senior at the college. I'm from Gadsden, Alabama.
Good to see you.
So we talked a lot today about, you know, the supremacists or the haters, as y'all call them. But I want to ask about the white working class bloc in rural America and in the South. The people who don't show up to the marches, people who might not even post racist things on Facebook, but the people who feel alienated and ostracized from our side because they feel like we're not serving them.
Yes.
And they feel like we think they're bigoted. How do we engage them? What do we do with them? How do we bring them back over to our side? And what is the role of commonalities, particularly between working class white people and people of color, i.e. socioeconomic status and religion, Reverend Brooks? What do we do with that? How do we utilize those commonalities to start bridging this divide and create a coalition that works for us?
You know, the divide you're talking about is so real. I worked just in my private capacity as a poll watcher in Florida during the campaign. And it was kind of a working class neighborhood, a diverse neighborhood, and diversity in that particular neighborhood meant black and white. Mm-hmm. And so you had a lot of white people going to the polls with Make America Great hats and whatnot. I certainly wouldn't consider them all bigots. Mm-hmm. And then black people going to the polls with maybe, you know, Clinton bumper stickers. And what was amazing to me was these people shared, you know, the same neighborhood, mm-hmm. faced the same problems, yet were pointing or pinning their hopes in such opposite directions. Exactly. And, you know, it reminded me of when Dr. King, at the Selma to Montgomery March in his speech at the end, he talked about how, you know, the ruling class in the South had used race to divide people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and I think that is still, you know, so true in our country. So I think kind of reducing racism, getting people to see the commonalities, and not vilifying people who are the kind of people perhaps that J.D. Vance talked about in his book Hillbilly Elegy. Mm-hmm. It's just so important.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I'm not from Alabama, I'm from South Carolina, which probably has a variation of the same challenges in Alabama. I think part of the challenge here is manifested in the form of culture, economics, and faith. So in the South, I think we have lost the opportunity to bring working class whites and people of diverse communities together because we have lost seemingly have lost the ability to express our shared cultural legacy, right? That could be from food, athletics, all kinds of things. But that cultural piece of politics is incredibly important, particularly in the South. Faith, not in any way that's exclusive and xenophobic, but you see some of the most conservative folks and the most progressive folks coming together in moments of moral crisis to express moral outrage. We need to use those moments to actually bring people together and keep them together. And then lastly, economics. So when we go back to Reconstruction and we look at the laws that were passed that supported public education, that supported the rights of women, that lifted the boats, if you will, of those of the bottom who were black and white in the South. We've got to literally learn the lessons of history in terms of bringing people together, economically speaking, culturally speaking, that shared language of faith, so that you don't have working class whites whose chief luxury in life is not being black.
Right.
That can't be the best thing for you, for your children.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I want to really thank Richard Cohen, Cornell, William Brooks, Archon Fung. It's been very, very insightful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.